Hi, my name is Nancy, and I work with the International Socialist Organization. And I just want to start by saying I, like I'm sure many other people who are here tonight, are deeply indebted to your work. It's been absolutely essential in helping us cut through the kind of garbage that we're faced with every day when we try to figure out what's going on in the world. But I think there's also, if I can continue, I think there is also a problem in the analysis that I've seen in your works and that you presented tonight, in the sense that I think we can tend to lose the forest for the trees, that you present so many, astonishing details about what is wrong with the system and about what is wrong with the media, that we can tend to lose sight of what I think the really key question is, which is why is this control necessary in the first place? And I would submit at least that I think it's because there's I got a minute and a half, I swear to God it's no longer. It's because there's antagonistic interests involved. They didn't talk about milkmaids and dairy maids and spinsters and laborers in the 17th century for no reason. It was because they were the working class. And what we see today in this country, I think, is quite frankly, let's speak bluntly, a ruling class which tries to control a working class population. And that's what it's about, is holding on to that power. If that's the case, then it seems like to me the question that we face is how to organize to change that system, to challenge capitalism. And I think in that effort, you do a disservice to your listeners and to the people who respect your work when you equate Lenin with Stalinism as blithely as you did tonight. I say that, and I think it's also important to point out that that is an unquestioned assumption and also an easy applause getter we saw that you share with the mainstream media. And I think if it were actually that simple, the horrific kinds of measures that even bourgeois historians describe as a counter-revolution under Stalin would not have been necessary if they were all the same to begin with. Now, in short, to sum up, the situation that you have outlined tonight, I think, is extremely serious, and I think it's important that we all take it seriously. What we're talking about is literally the fate of millions of lives around the world, particularly in the international politics that you described. That being the case, then I think we need a full and a serious and a fair discussion of various different alternatives, not just talking about the horrors of capitalism, but actually how to change it to end this stuff once and for all.
Well, I think you made it, I think, well, there's several questions there. One is about the discussion of the United States, and I think what I said is approximately what you said, except I didn't use some of that rhetoric. Which I don't think is particularly helpful, to tell you the truth, either analytically or to understand or whatever, but it's the same picture. John Jay had it straight. The people who own the country ought to govern it, and the people who own the country have basically now are a network of corporations and conglomerates and banks and so on. They ought to govern it, and the way they do it is by the methods we've described. Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for a workers' organization and so on. In fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it. Doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And you could say they're defective instruments, that had to be worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, it was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism.